This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast, How Did We Get Here?, I try to provide context and background to a big story in the news. Well, coronavirus continues to be the big story. For this edition, I've been talking to Dr. Ron Daniels. He's been an intensive care consultant with the NHS for 18 years. He takes us into the world he now inhabits, a world of night shifts, silent wards, colleagues he can't even recognise behind all their protective kit. It's an eyewitness account of what is happening inside the wards where the battle against Covid-19 is being fought. Dr. Ron Daniels, thanks very much for joining me for this episode of How Did We Get Here? So let's go right back to basics. You're an NHS consultant working in the current situation. Just describe to me, if you can, how the shift starts for you. What's the first thing when you come in to the hospital? How does it start?
So far since the COVID-19 crisis started, I've exclusively done night shifts, and that's the first thing that's very different, because having been a consultant for 18 years, I haven't done night shifts during that period of time, at least not resident on call in the hospital. So that's a novel experience. But to get back to the question, what we do, we sit and hand over, and that's really important because that identifies what's going on with our patients, the nuances, the details. We can hear about what's happened during the day in terms of decision making, in terms of communication with families. And that's the only time at which we get to deal with that level of detail. Because, of course, once we've completed handover, we're in PPE, it's difficult to hear each other, we lose our peripheral vision, and we're focused on the patients. And critically, and I think it's reasonable to say this, we shouldn't be exposing ourselves to too much time with the patients. So we should be minimising time so that we can deliver the effective care that individual patient needs, but we shouldn't be standing at the bedside, exposing ourselves to viral risk, discussing conversations with the families. So the handover period is critical for all of that detail.
Okay, so you have the handover, then you mentioned going into PPE, personal protection equipment. Just give us an idea of exactly what it is you're putting on that might be different to normal circumstances.
So I can describe the situation where I work, which will be mirrored in many intensive care units up and down the country, but it won't be identical in every unit. We have the support of the military's defence medical services in getting logistics of PPE sorted, but also directly in supervising us, putting on the PPE, taking off the PPE. So what we have a station immediately adjacent to the handover room where we have visual instructions to remind us in what order to put things on. So we start with our full-length gown. Now, ideally, that's something like a surgical gown, but as we've all heard, it's increasingly difficult to access surgical gowns. As long as it's full length and as long as it's waterproof, then that's okay. The next thing we do is we cover our hair. The next thing we do is to put the all-important FFP3 mask on. We then apply eye protection, be it a visor or a pair of goggles, and then we apply our gloves. Now, if we're using the plastic disposable gowns, then we have to tape the gloves in place because they don't seal very well. But if we're using surgical gowns, that's not so necessary. Once we've done that, we make sure that we're readily identifiable. So in our intensive care units, we have essentially electrical tape of different colours that apply to your designation. We write our name clearly. We have different coloured stickers for doctors, even different coloured stickers for intensive care doctors versus non-intensive care doctors, and similarly for nurses. So the idea is that we supervise each other putting PPE on. We have records of the donning of PPE before we enter the ward and who supervise that. and we make sure that we're clearly visible to everyone. Because, to be honest, once people are in PPE, you can't tell one person from another unless they've got their name clearly visible.
Right, I just want to clarify one thing. So did you say you got members of the military there physically as you're putting the gear on?
Yeah, not all the time, but at certain times they're there to, again, reinforce, make sure everyone's doing it properly, getting it drilled into us to do it correctly every time.
Okay, and once you put it on, describe how does that alter the way you're feeling and how you're able to interact with other people?
Well, I think it's fair to say that applying PPE, the process of it heightens anxiety because it's reminding us of the risk. Now, of course, it's there to protect us, but it's a constant reminder. Your breathing feels different when you've got an FFP3 mask on, so you're conscious of your breathing the whole time. You're conscious of the seal around your face, and it begins to chafe after a period of time. In the visor or the goggles, even though your mask is well fitted, you'll sometimes get fogging and condensation, so you sometimes have to take a moment before you can see things clearly. Your peripheral vision's affected. Your dexterity is slightly affected. You know, the surgical gowns are slightly restrictive of movement. The gloves, we're not always using precision surgical gloves, so they do affect dexterity because they're disposable nitrile gloves. And so you are compromised in the way that you operate.
It makes the job harder, basically.
Absolutely, it does. And communication between people. For those who failed a fit test with the mask, they have to wear the respirator hoods, and they are really quite noisy and even more restrictive of peripheral vision. So absolutely, it makes the job harder.
Why would they have failed the test with the masks?
So different face shapes. The masks are designed for an average face shape, and people with different face shapes can fail fit tests. Men particularly with facial hair. Now, they might preserve facial hair for cultural and religious reasons, of course, but equally, people who have fast-growing beards, they might fit a mask in the morning when they're clean-shaven, but unless they're also able to shave in the middle of the day, the mask might not fit appropriately towards the end of the day. So they could have failed fit tests as well.
Okay, I just want to ask, if you didn't have all the equipment, the PPE you've described there, would you be prepared to go into the ward and work in that situation without all the kit that you've got?
No, absolutely not. And we would discourage our juniors to put themselves at risk also. The reality is we health professionals are the only defence people have against this virus at present. If we don't look after ourselves, then we're not going to be there in the future to look after our patients. So this is absolutely not a time for heroics. We teach our juniors, we encourage our colleagues to put ourselves first, our family second, if you like, and our patients third. So we're there to deliver the very best care we can for our patients, but we're not doing anyone any favours if in doing so we contract coronavirus and go off sick for 2 weeks at best.
I mean, there was obviously a change at the end of last week to the official guidance about what PPE was needed in what circumstances, mainly to do with gowns. What did you think of that?
So we've heard that there is a shortage of gowns. This is not surprising. We need an enormous number of gowns. I mean, my intensive care unit is relatively small. It's only 20-something beds, but we get through around 1,000 gowns a week. So it's unsurprising that there's a shortage. So we've heard guidance last week, specifically around gowns, around considering not wearing them if they weren't necessary. That would never apply in an intensive care unit if we're delivering direct patient care. We must always wear gowns. We've also heard that the FFP3 masks could be reused if they're folded inward and sealed in a bag. Now, I've seen a joint statement from 4 of the Royal Colleges, particularly in anaesthetics and intensive care, and I agree with that joint statement. We are not satisfied that there is evidence that a reused mask offers us as good protection as a new mask. So those colleges and I, as a consultant and leader in my organisation, are supportive of staff who would refuse to reuse a mask.
I mean, do you fear that the guidance is being altered more to reflect what is available rather than what is best practice?
I think that's fair, and I think there's some very difficult political messages here. Of course we have shortages of PPE. It's unsurprising. This is an unprecedented demand for PPE on a huge scale. It's not just that we're using 50% more, we're using thousands of percent more PPE than we normally would have to. So it's unsurprising that the supply chain sometimes is failing. We have to be pragmatic, I get that. We have to be fluid. We have to be prepared to move between manufacturers, consider alternatives. But each time we're fluid, each time we're pragmatic, we have to be doing it in a safe way. I'm not personally confident that reusing masks satisfies that safe way test. I am satisfied that, for example, if we're not directly providing patient care, which includes contact with bodily fluids, then it's reasonable for us to wear a plastic apron rather than a full-length surgical gown.
Okay, right. To get back to what we were talking about in terms of your day, you've got the gear on, you've got the PPE, you've put on the designation to show who you are, etc. What's the scene that greets you when you go into the ward?
So I think the first thing to say is, obviously, these are environments with which we're familiar. But normally we will be expecting to greet friends, to greet colleagues by visual recognition and facial recognition. And we can't do that. So we sort of peer at each other to see who's who and read the name tags and so forth. So that's slightly different. The next thing that's different, I'm lucky to work in an absolutely purpose-built intensive care unit where every single bed space is a private room. However, because of demand, we're now having to have 2 people in some of those private rooms, and that's very different. The doors are closed, whereas normally the doors will primarily be open.
Are you having much interaction with the patients?
So in intensive care at the moment, at least 2/3, the national level is just around 2/3 of patients are sedated and on a ventilator. So in that situation, we do try to have the patient pleasantly drowsy. So they are able to answer questions, they are able to nod, to shake their head, but they can't verbally communicate. Some of our patients have tracheostomy tubes in, the ones who've been there a little longer, and those patients will be more conscious, by and large, be more awake.
Just remind us exactly what that would be, the tracheostomy tubes.
So a tracheostomy tube is a small breathing tube that's inserted through the front of the neck under local anaesthetic and sedation, typically when the patient's been on a ventilator for a few days and it becomes clear they're going to need ventilator support for a few days more. It's more comfortable for the patient. The patient can be awake with a tracheostomy tube in, whereas with a normal breathing tube, that would be very uncomfortable. And it's easier for the nursing staff to deliver nursing care.
Okay. And what care can you actually deliver? What treatment can you deliver to people?
There's very little in terms of treatment that we can deliver that's specific to COVID-19 patients. This is about organ support. This is about providing the care to take over the function of failing organs in the hope that the person's immune system will kick in time and begin to fight the virus. So we have no magic antibiotic, no magic antiviral therapy. There's no panacea to help to restore these patients to function more quickly. One thing we have learned, and we've learned this within the last couple of months really, is that patients with COVID-19, when they deteriorate rapidly, it's often because they have small blood clots forming in their lung blood vessels or anywhere else in the body, and that starts to cause rapidly organ failure. So what we have learned is that we increase the amount of blood thinning drugs that we give to these patients, and that's likely to result in improved outcomes. But can we do something to treat it and reverse it? No.
And oxygen often is key to this as well, isn't it, in terms of helping them to breathe?
So the functions of oxygen, patients with COVID-19, by the time they arrive at hospital, will either be there because they've got very low blood oxygen levels and somebody, perhaps even one of their family, has noticed that they look a bit bluish, or they'll be there because they're very, very breathless. Now, we deliver oxygen therapy to improve the amount of oxygen in the blood, which improves the amount of oxygen delivered to the organs, which reduces the risk of multi-organ failure developing. But we also give it for symptomatic relief. The body responds to low levels of oxygen, and this effect is slightly altered in patients with COVID-19 for reasons we don't fully understand as yet. But the body responds to low oxygen levels by increasing the work of breathing, which is distressing for a patient. So we give oxygen also to improve the work of breathing.
I mean, how distressed are patients?
Some patients can be very distressed, but often the distress is born from the anxiety, the fear that is associated with this condition. And we understand that. This is associated as a condition with a slightly higher mortality rate than most other conditions that require intensive care support.
I suppose the other thing that's unusual in that scene in the ward is there are no members of the family. There are no nearest and dearest in there, are there?
No, that's absolutely right. And our practice certainly is to allow, if there's an end-of-life situation, one single family member into the bedside. But that sort of practice will vary from hospital to hospital. But by and large, yes, it's eerie. There aren't relatives by the bedside. Normally in intensive care, most patients would have one or two relatives by their bedside for most of the daylight hours of every day. It's eerie to see that not happening. And we have in our hospital, we have medical students guided by recently retired consultants doing the day-to-day telephone updates with the relatives. They don't have the empathy. They don't have the emotion. It's more didactic and it's difficult to deliver information, particularly if it's bad news about a patient deteriorating in that manner. We also have, of course, the challenge of relatives who understandably want to communicate with their loved one and having to do so remotely. That's very difficult for them. And again, the empathy, the real raw emotion doesn't tend to come through in quite the same way.
Does this all make for a different atmosphere to what you would normally expect in that ward?
Well, it is very different. It is, well, we're actually on the ward. It is generally far more sombre. We make no excuse in a speciality that deals with life and death as part of our routine daily business. In normal situations, having a bit of banter between staff, having some downtime. But during the ward rounds, it's now really quite sombre, really quite serious. We then do allow ourselves, when we're on breaks, when we're having downtime, to relax a little, to support each other. But it has really changed from the banter through to the supporting each other and saying, how are you? And that is helped. And I'm not just saying this, it really is helped by the fact that local restaurants and takeaways and businesses are supplying us with food and goodies. It really keeps the morale of staff up because it is a massively challenging situation.
How can I put this? What's your success rate? How many people that go into that intensive care unit are coming out and are going to get through?
So I can't be specific about my unit in terms of confidentiality, but if you were to ask, have we seen patients survive this condition and leave intensive care? Emphatically, yes. Have I seen patients who are older or who have underlying medical conditions survive intensive care? Again, emphatically, yes. If you look at the national situation, the national data, around 1 in 2 patients who's ill enough to need ventilating for COVID-19 ends up surviving. Now, that, of course, is worse odds than we normally see and worse odds than most people would hope for. But the point I'm trying to get across here is being ventilated for COVID-19 is by no means a death sentence. You have a 50-50 chance of making it, and we will do our level best to make sure you're in the right half.
I mean, 50-50, though, as you say, is worse than normally in terms of people going into that sort of unit. I mean, does that take its toll on you?
Well, it absolutely does. And it's compounded again by the fact that we don't have that human interaction in the same way during the ward round when we're physically on the ward. We don't have that interaction in the same way with our patients because we are separated from them by the physical barrier of PPE and the sort of noise barrier and the visual barrier that brings about. And it's also challenging because of often having to watch quite harrowing virtual conversations between loved ones as somebody is approaching the end of life. As I've said earlier, we do allow the next of kin to be with the patient, but that might be their spouse, it might be that their children have to say goodbye via FaceTime or Skype, and that's really hard.
So they're having virtual conversations. The last conversations they have are online often.
They really are. And one of the observations that we tend to make about intensive care as people progress through the speciality is that at the outset, people are seduced by the adrenaline, the resuscitating patients in A&E, the restoring patients to life. But as we progress through an intensive care career, the most rewarding part of intensive care for most people is managing the dying process well. And that's been taken away from us now. The reality is we do our best. We're learning how to do this ever better using virtual techniques, but there is no substitute to being in a room, showing empathy for a patient's family, understanding, sharing their tears.
How do you feel the system, and in that I include people like yourself, is bearing up under this?
I think there's two ways really of looking at the system. There's the supply chain and logistics, and that's been addressed significantly within media to date. What hasn't been addressed is the mental health of health professionals. And by nature, we are a resilient and professional bunch, but this is going to take its toll. Because of the professionalism within healthcare, I don't think it's going to take its toll right now. I think as the Covid-19 pandemic starts to wane, people are going to sit back, take stock, and think, what the hell hit us? And the mental health of all health professionals, including sort of grizzled consultants for 18 years like myself, is going to be really challenged.
How do you, at the moment, try and deal with it? How do you feel when you come off shift, and how do you try and find a way to get yourself ready for the next one?
Well, I could answer that in a slightly flippant way, which is in a similar way to the majority of the population. I think our gardens, our homes, our cars have never looked more pristine than they do at the moment. So throwing myself into domestic activities, but less flippantly, obviously having a supportive family around me is the single most important thing. Having the support of colleagues, the WhatsApp groups, the Teams meetings, and so forth, where we discuss, where we check each other are okay, where we ask about each other's family. That doesn't normally happen on a day-to-day basis, but it's happening right now. And then something that I really want to say, others have said it, but I'm going to repeat, the clap for carers, the clap for key workers, that is so emotive for health professionals, and it really, really makes a difference.
Dr. Daniels, thanks very, very much for talking to us, and obviously thank you very much for the work that you and your colleagues are doing. It's been very good to talk to you. Thank you.
More than welcome.
Dr. Ron Daniels sharing his gruelling and moving experiences from inside an intensive care unit in a hospital in the West Midlands. He can be found tweeting at Sepsis UK. He is also the founder of the UK Sepsis Trust. If you have any thoughts on this or ideas for another podcast, you can email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at AndyBell5News. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There will be another soon, and in the meantime, stay safe.